Buy me that 725,000-pound mansion, or you will never touch your grandchildren's faces again. That is exactly what Rhiannon, my new daughter-in-law, hissed at me right in the middle of her wedding day.
I am Alan Wynne. In her eyes, I was nothing but a pathetic, retired lighthouse keeper living in poverty, wearing clearance rack clothes and driving a rusted-out Land Rover. She treated me like trash, a burden, and was dead sure she could use my own flesh and blood to extort me. But Rhiannon had no idea about the shattering truth. The old man she was humiliating was actually a millionaire with a secret fortune exceeding £21 million. She thought she had me cornered, but she had actually just detonated a bomb that would blow her professional gold-digging career to pieces right on that wedding stage. You will not believe the horrific face hiding behind that extravagant white dress. Before I expose this noble bride's entire scam, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. And tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you pay the ransom just to see your grandkids, or would you unleash a brutal lesson on this greedy predator? The Irish Sea has a way of stripping everything down to its core. In Aberystwyth, the wind doesn't just blow, it scours. It carries the salt and the cold into every crack of the promenade, and, if you aren't careful, into the very marrow of your bones. I stood by the window of my flat, watching the grey waves crash against the stone defences, feeling the familiar draft whistling through the poorly sealed frame. My name is Alan Wynne. To the postman and the few neighbours who bother to nod my way, I am just a retired lighthouse keeper, living out a quiet, somewhat gritty existence in a third-floor walk-up that costs me £950 a month. The walls are thin enough to hear the college students downstairs arguing over their laundry, and the carpet has a permanent scent of damp wool and old tea. Outside, parked in a spot full of potholes, is my 1998 Land Rover Defender. Its British racing green paint has long since faded to a dull, chalky moss, and the wheel wells are beginning to succumb to the iron-eating rust of the Welsh coast. To the world, I look like a man who has been defeated by life, a relic of a bygone industrial age just waiting for the tide to go out one last time. But appearances are the ultimate currency, and I happen to be very, very wealthy. 4 years ago, in the spring of 2020, I signed a set of documents that changed my financial reality forever. I sold my shipbuilding firm, Wynne Marine, for £18.4 million. After the taxes were settled and the lawyers took their pound of flesh, I walked away with a fortune. Today, through careful investment in wind farms and commercial property, that figure has grown to £21.5 million in liquid assets, bringing in a passive income of roughly £55,000 every single month. I could be living in a manor house in the rolling hills of the Cotswolds. I could be driving a vehicle that doesn't leak onto the passenger seat every time it drizzles. Instead, I shop at discount warehouses, buy generic brand cereal, and wear a £30 suit I found on a clearance rack for special occasions. People ask me why. They don't ask with their voices, of course, but I see it in their eyes. The pity, the slight curl of the lip. The answer is simple and painful. I learned during my divorce from my ex-wife, Sian, that when people see the money, they stop seeing the man. They start calculating. They look at you and see a series of zero-interest loans or a shortcut to a lifestyle they haven't earned. Sian left me for her trainer 3 months after the papers were signed, taking a £3.1 million settlement with her. She didn't want a loon. She wanted the shipyard's dividends. So, I decided to run a test. I wanted to see who would stand by me if the shipbuilding mogul vanished and only the broke lighthouse keeper remained. The results have been a slow-motion heartbreak. My son, Ioan, is 34 now. He's a heritage conservator in Cardiff, a man who spends his days protecting the history and dignity of old stone buildings and ancient monuments. You would think a man with that profession would value the dignity of his own father, but money, or the perceived lack of it, has a way of eroding even the strongest foundations. Our relationship used to be built on long talks about engineering and the sea. I worked 70-hour weeks when he was a boy, building Wynn Marine from a single shed into a powerhouse. Also, he could have the education and the peace of mind I never had. But after the divorce, and after I moved into this drafty flat, Yuan started to drift. He didn't choose a side in the divorce. He simply chose the side that looked more successful. He's embarrassed by me. I see it every time he visits Aberystwyth. He refuses to let me pick him up in the Land Rover, claiming the AM-only radio and the rattling engine give him a headache. We went from weekly dinners to monthly phone calls that felt more like check-ins with a distant, failing relative. Then came Rhiannon Vaughan. Yuan brought her to meet me 18 months ago. She's a high-end real estate consultant in Cardiff, the kind of woman who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. When she walked into my flat, she didn't see a home. She saw a distressed asset. I watched her eyes do a clinical sweep of the room. The second-hand sofa, the stack of bills on the kitchen table, the generic tea bags. "So, Yuan mentioned you were a lighthouse keeper," she asked, her voice dripping with a forced sweetness that tasted like copper. "Retired," I said simply. "Must be. Peaceful," she replied, but the way she looked at my stained coffee mug suggested she thought the word was pathetic. Since that day, Rhiannon has treated me like dead weight. To her, I am an embarrassing footnote in Yuan's rising social narrative. She sees him as a man on the move, a Cardiff professional with a bright future, and she sees me as the anchor dragging him back into the mud of the working class. We had dinner together last month at a small bistro in Cardiff. I had driven down in the Land Rover, which was coughing blue smoke by the time I hit the city limits. I was wearing my best discount suit, trying to look presentable for my son. Rhiannon spent the entire evening subtly chipping away at my dignity. "Oh, Alun," she said loudly enough for the neighbouring table to hear, "don't worry about the bill. I know your pension doesn't go very far these days. I'll cover the tip." Yuan laughed, that uncomfortable, high-pitched sound he makes when he knows something is wrong but lacks the spine to fix it. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell her that his father was the man who taught him how to read a blueprint. He just stared at his steak and let her belittle me. Rhiannon's disdain isn't just about my clothes or my car. It's about what I can't give her. She has been dropping hints for months about a good family supporting the next generation. She's picked out a £725 villa in the Cardiff suburbs, a place with 4 bedrooms and a view of the bay. She talks about it constantly, usually while looking directly at me, as if she's trying to conjure a down payment out of my threadbare pockets. "Children need stability," she told me once, her eyes hard as flint. "They need grandparents who can contribute, who add value to their lives. If a family member is going to be a burden instead of a blessing, well, choices have to be made." The threat was as clear as the Irish Sea on a calm day. Prove your worth with a checkbook, or you'll be cut out of the family tree. Yuan is already pulling away, his phone calls becoming shorter, his excuses for not visiting becoming more creative. He's being coached by a woman who views love as a business transaction, and he's too blinded by her dream to see the hook in the bait. I sat in my drafty flat tonight, holding a cold cup of tea, and looked at a leather portfolio resting on my scarred wooden table. Inside are the bank statements, the property deeds, and the proof of the £21.5 million that Rhiannon thinks I don't have. The wedding is in 3 days. I know what's coming. Yuan will call me, sounding awkward and desperate, asking for a small loan for the house that he knows I can't afford. Rhiannon will be in the background, whispering the words into his ear. They will try to squeeze blood from what they think is a stone. Part of me wanted to just write the check, to buy back my son's affection and secure my place in the lives of my future grandchildren. But if I do that, I'll never know if Ayuan loves his father or if he just loves the investment I represent. The lighthouse keeper's job is to warn ships of the rocks. I've spent my life navigating the rough waters of industry and the even rougher waters of betrayal. Rhiannon thinks she's the one setting the trap, but she's forgotten one thing about being underestimated. It's the most powerful position you can ever occupy. The wedding at the castle is meant to be the start of her new life. She has no idea that I'm bringing the storm with me. Cardiff always feels faster than Aberystwyth. It is a city that hums with the sound of new money, glass buildings, and the relentless ambition of people trying to outrun their own shadows. I felt the difference the moment I pulled my 1998 Land Rover onto the polished asphalt of the Bay Area. My engine rattled like a box of loose bolts, and a thin trail of blue smoke followed me past the gleaming Teslas and Range Rovers parked outside the luxury lofts. To the onlookers in the high-end coffee shops, I was a smudge on their perfect landscape, a relic of a working-class past they were trying to forget. I was there to visit Iwan and Rhiannon at their downtown flat. They were paying £1,850 a month for a place with high ceilings and exposed brick, a heritage aesthetic that Iwan, as a conservator, found meaningful, and Rhiannon, as a status seeker, found marketable. When I walked through the door, Rhiannon didn't offer to take my coat, which was just as well, as it was a faded waxed jacket that had seen too many rainy nights on the coast. Instead, she gave me that quick, clinical sweep of the eyes I had grown to dread. She looked at my scuffed boots and the way I held my generic brand grocery bag containing a modest bottle of wine. "Oh, a loon," she said, her voice a sharp contrast to the soft jazz playing in the background. "You shouldn't have bothered with the wine. We usually prefer something a bit more vintage. But it's the thought that counts, I suppose." Iwan looked away, pretending to be very interested in the way the sunlight hit the floorboards. He looked tired. The wedding planning was draining him, both emotionally and financially. He was a software engineer and a conservator, making a decent living of about £95,000 a year, but Rhiannon's dream wedding was a black hole that swallowed every penny he had. I knew his credit cards were likely maxed out, all to fund a one-day performance at Swansea Castle. Dinner was a tense affair of small portions and pointed comments. Rhiannon had spent the last 8 months planning this wedding like a military operation, ensuring every detail suggested they were a couple on the rise. But tonight, the focus shifted from the wedding to the next chapter. "Good families understand that the real work begins after the I-dos," Rhiannon said, swirling her expensive Cabernet. "My friend Ashley's parents just helped them secure a gorgeous place in the suburbs. It's about building a foundation, isn't it? Putting love into action." Ayuan cleared his throat. He wouldn't look at me. "Dad, we've found a place. It's a villa on the outskirts of Cardiff. 4 bedrooms, a proper garden. It's £725,000. I felt the weight of the silence that followed. In the role I had chosen to play, the broke, retired lighthouse keeper, that number was supposed to be an impossibility. "That's a lot of money, Iwan," I said quietly. "A very big stretch for a young couple." "Which is why we're asking for help," Rhiannon cut in, her tone losing its veneer of sweetness. "We need £145,000 for a 20% down payment, to keep the monthly costs manageable, for the future." "I don't have that kind of money," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I live on a pension, Rhiannon. You know that. I'm just a man with an old truck and a small flat in Aber." The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Rhiannon set her glass down with a definitive click. "Iwan, why don't you go check on the dessert in the kitchen?" I want to speak to your father privately for a moment. Yuan hesitated, looking between us like a man caught between a landslide and a rising tide. But he was weak. He stood up and retreated into the kitchen without a word, leaving me alone with the woman who was systematically dismantling his life. Rhiannon leaned across the table. Her eyes, which I had once thought were merely cold, were now predatory. Let's stop the charade, Alun. I've done my homework. I know you sold a shipyard years ago. I know there was a divorce, but there had to be something left. Nobody lives like a hermit unless they're hoarding something. Whatever I had is gone, Rhiannon, I said, keeping my voice level. Investments go bad. Life is expensive. Then you'd better find a way to get it back, she hissed, because here is the reality you're failing to grasp. That house isn't just a building. It's the gateway to your future. Yuan and I want children soon. 3 of them. And those children will need a stable environment. They will need grandparents who add value to their lives. She paused, letting the word value hang in the air like a threat. Value, she continued, means more than just showing up for a birthday. It means college funds. It means financial security. It means being a blessing rather than a burden. My parents in North Wales are already prepared to be the primary grandparents. They've already committed to being the involved ones. Are you threatening me, Rhiannon? I asked. My heart was thumping, but not with fear. It was the cold, hard rhythm of a man who had spent 20 years making difficult decisions in a boardroom. I'm giving you an ultimatum, she replied, her smile now a jagged line of malice. The house offer expires on Monday. If we lose it because you're too cheap to help your only son, I will make sure Iowan understands exactly what kind of man you are, bitter. Selfish, a man who puts his own grudges ahead of his son's happiness. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. If you don't provide that £145,000, you will never see your grandchildren. I will cut you out of their lives so completely that they won't even know your name. I will make sure Eon is too embarrassed to ever bring them to that damp little flat of yours. You'll be a stranger to your own blood. An investment that failed. It was a business transaction. She was attempting to sell me access to my own family, using a currency I supposedly didn't have. It was the most calculated, professional piece of manipulation I had ever witnessed, and I had dealt with corporate raiders for decades. You have until the wedding toasts to give me your answer, she said, standing up and smoothing her dress. Make it public. Show everyone what kind of grandfather you intend to be. I left shortly after that. The drive back to Aberystwyth was long and dark. The Land Rover's headlights were weak, barely cutting through the Welsh mist, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. The test was over. I had wanted to know if people would love me for who I was, and I had found out that the woman my son was marrying saw me only as a ledger to be balanced. But Rhiannon had made a fatal error. She had identified my deepest fear, losing my connection to Ewan, and tried to weaponize it. She assumed that because I lived like a poor man, I lacked the resources to fight back. She didn't realize that being underestimated is a position of absolute power. As soon as I reached my flat, I didn't go to bed. I sat at my small kitchen table, the one Rhiannon had looked at with such disdain, and opened my laptop. I didn't look at bank statements or investment portfolios. I looked for a contact I hadn't used in months. I dialed the number. It was late, but the woman on the other end answered on the second ring. Alun? Lowry, I said. It's time. I need the full workup on Rhiannon Vaughan. Everything. Bank records, past associations, and specifically, I want to know about her history before she moved to Cardiff. Lowry Griffith was a private investigator. I'd kept on a quiet retainer ever since Ewan had first brought Rhiannon home. Something about her had always felt too practiced, too focused on the financial support aspect of family. I've already got a start on her, Alun. Lowry's voice was steady and professional. She's had 3 previous engagements, all of them with men from families with significant holdings. All of them ended right around the time house deposits were discussed. Get it all finalized, I told her. I need the documentation in a leather portfolio, bank statements, property records, and the background checks. I want a complete picture by the time I reach the castle. You're going to go through with it then, at the wedding? She wanted a public answer, I said, looking out at the dark Irish Sea. I think it's only fair that I give her exactly what she asked for. I hung up the phone. I felt a strange sense of calm. For months, I had been a spectator in my own life, watching my son drift away and allowing myself to be insulted by a woman who wasn't fit to carry my name. But the rules had changed. This wasn't about a house anymore. This was about protecting the foundation of my family from a predator. Sometimes the quiet ones do indeed pack the biggest punch. Rhiannon thought she was setting a trap for a broke old man. She had no idea she had just walked into the center of a storm that had been brewing for 20 years. I looked at the Land Rover parked in the street below. The rusted, reliable machine that everyone laughed at. It wasn't pretty, and it didn't look like much, but it could handle terrain that would break a luxury car in half. Just like its owner. The wedding was in 3 days. I had my answer ready, and it wouldn't be a check. The sun was uncharacteristically bright for a May afternoon in Wales, but the light felt sharp, almost surgical, as it bounced off the grey stone walls of Swansea Castle. It was May 12th, exactly 14:45, and the air held a lingering chill from the Bristol Channel that my thin 30-pound clearance rack suit did nothing to stop. I stood by the stone archway of the courtyard, watching the steady stream of luxury sedans and sports cars discharge guests who looked like they had stepped out of a high-end lifestyle magazine. I had parked my 1998 Land Rover as far from the entrance as possible. Its rusted wheel wells and the persistent rattle of its diesel engine felt like an insult to the manicured perfection Rhiannon had curated for this day. I felt like a smudge of grease on a silk sheet. But as I walked toward the great hall, I felt the familiar weight of the leather portfolio tucked under my arm, hidden beneath my jacket. It was my anchor. Inside, the castle was a testament to excess. Rhiannon had spared no expense, or rather, she had spared none of Iwan's future earnings. The hall was filled with the scent of expensive lilies, and the low, sophisticated hum of 180 guests. I looked for my son and found him near the altar, looking stiff and uncomfortable in a charcoal morning suit that probably cost more than my first 3 cars combined. He looked 34 going on 12, nervous, pale, and constantly checking his watch. When he saw me, his expression flickered between relief and a deep, simmering embarrassment. He gave me a quick nod, but didn't come over. He couldn't. Rhiannon was already there, a vision in a lace gown that I knew for a fact was a designer piece borrowed from a friend to maintain the illusion of her status. She looked radiant, innocent, and utterly lethal. As the ceremony began, I found my place. I wasn't in the front row. I wasn't even in the first 5. I was relegated to table 7, tucked into a back corner near the service doors where the draft from the kitchen was strongest. My table companions were a few distant cousins I hadn't seen since the shipbuilding days, and a couple of Rhiannon's work acquaintances who spent the entire time checking their phones. To the world, and especially to the bride, I was the unimportant guest, the broke father who was lucky to have a seat at all. "Lovely ceremony, isn't it?" a woman to my left asked. She was wearing a hat that looked like it cost a month of my rent. "I'm a friend of Rhiannon's family from Portland. And you are?" "Alun," I said, offering a small, practiced smile. "I'm Iowan's father." Her eyes did that quick, involuntary sweep, taking in the cheap fabric of my suit and my weathered hands. "Oh," she said, her voice dropping an octave in pity. "How nice that you could make it down from, where was it? Aberystwyth." That's the one, I replied. I went back to my drink, a warm ginger ale. I didn't mind being ignored. In fact, I counted on it. From my vantage point at table 7, I could see the entire room. I saw Lowry Griffith, my private investigator, blending perfectly into the crowd near the bar. I saw Gwilym Evans, the notary who had handled my shipyard sale, sitting at the head table as the officiant. He caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The pieces were on the board. Dinner was served at 17:30. It was a choice of poached salmon or herb-crusted chicken, served on plates that cost £85 a head. I watched Ian agonize over his plate, barely eating a bite. He looked like a man who had realized he was drowning but didn't want to ruin the aesthetic of the pool. The speeches began during the dessert course. The best man told a few safe jokes. The maid of honor cried on cue. Then Rhiannon stood up. She held her champagne glass with the grace of a seasoned performer. The room went quiet, captivated by her sweet preschool teacher persona. She thanked everyone for coming, her voice trembling just enough to seem genuine. "Yuan and I are so grateful for the love in this room," she began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "But as we start this new chapter, we realize that love is more than just a feeling. It's an investment. Some families understand that. They understand that when the next generation is strong, the whole family thrives." A few people clapped. Rhiannon leaned into the microphone, her gaze shifting, locking onto mine at table 7. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating hardness I had seen in Cardiff. "That's why we're so hopeful tonight," she continued, her voice projecting to the very back of the hall. "We've found a beautiful home in the suburbs, a place where our children, Alun's future grandchildren, can grow up with the stability they deserve. But dreams require support. They require family members who are willing to put their money where their heart is." The room went deathly silent. This wasn't a wedding toast, it was a public shaming. I could see the confusion on the faces of the guests. They were looking at me. The old man in the cheap suit at the back table, and then back at the beautiful bride. "So," Rhiannon said, her smile sharp enough to draw blood, "I'd like to raise a glass to my father-in-law, Alun Wynn. We're all waiting to see the decision he makes tonight. The decision that will show us all if he wants to be a real part of this family's future, or just a memory from the past. To family investment." She raised her glass. A few people joined her, their voices uncertain, the air thick with the kind of discomfort that makes your skin crawl. She sat down, looking satisfied. She had done it. In front of 180 witnesses, she had framed my refusal to pay £145,000 as a betrayal of my own flesh and blood. She thought she had backed me into a corner where my only choices were public humiliation or financial surrender. Yuan looked like he wanted to vanish into the stone floor. He looked at me, his eyes full of a desperate, silent apology, but he didn't speak. He was still waiting for someone else to fix his life. I stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet room. Nancy Miller, the wedding planner I'd known for years, appeared beside me and handed me a wireless microphone. Rhiannon's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected me to have a mic ready. "Thank you, Rhiannon," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of 20 years of command. That was illuminating. I walked away from table 7, moving slowly toward the head table. With every step, I felt the old Alun Wynn coming back. The man who had built a maritime empire from nothing, the man who had navigated strikes, recessions, and corporate sharks. It's a bold thing to ask for £145,000 in front of a room full of strangers, I said into the mic. I saw a few guests gasp. The specific number hit the room like a physical blow. But you're right about one thing, Rhiannon. This is about investment. It's about what we value. I reached the head table and stopped. I looked at my son, then at the woman who had spent months treating me like a burden and a trash relic of a life she wanted to bury. You want me to prove my love with a check, I said, my voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that somehow reached every corner of the silent hall. You've made it clear that if I don't buy that house, I lose my son and my grandchildren. You've turned my family into a business transaction. Rhiannon's face had gone pale, her frozen smile beginning to crack. Alun, this isn't the place. You made it the place, I interrupted. You wanted a public answer. You wanted everyone to see what kind of father I am. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the leather portfolio. The room was so quiet I could hear the wind whistling through the castle's arrow slits. Well, I said, laying the portfolio on the table with a definitive thud. I think it's time we all see what kind of daughter-in-law you are, because before we talk about my money, we need to talk about your secrets. I opened the portfolio. The first document I pulled out wasn't a check. It was a photograph. Rhiannon stared at it, and for the first time that day, the predator realized she was the one in the trap. The storm had finally arrived at Swansea Castle, and I was the one who had brought the lightning. The leather portfolio felt heavy under my arm, a physical weight that anchored me as I walked toward the head table. The great hall of Swansea Castle, which only moments ago had been filled with the triumphant, poisonous ringing of Rhiannon's voice, was now so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the shadows. 180 people were staring at me. Some looked with pity, others with the morbid curiosity of those watching a slow-motion wreck. I didn't look at them. I looked at Iowan. My son sat with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in that expensive morning suit as if the fabric itself was made of lead. He was ashamed of me, he was ashamed of the poverty I represented, and he was terrified of the public fallout of my refusal to pay. I reached the podium and placed the portfolio on the oak surface. With a dull thud, the sound seemed to ripple through the room like a stone dropped into a deep well. "Thank you, Rhiannon," I said, my voice steady, and carrying a resonance I hadn't used in years. "You've spent a lot of time today talking about family investment. You've used my son, my future grandchildren, and even this room full of guests to try and force a hand you thought was empty. You wanted a public answer. Well, it's only fair I give you the full picture first." I saw Rhiannon's smile flicker. It was the first crack in the mask. She leaned back, trying to maintain her noble bride composure, but her fingers were white where they gripped her champagne flute. "You did your research on me, didn't you?" I continued, opening the portfolio slowly. "You looked into Alun Wyn. You found out about the shipyard sale in 2020. You found out about the divorce from Sian. You saw the Land Rover and the flat in Aberystwyth, and you calculated that I was a man who had either lost it all or was too bitter to share what was left. I pulled out the first document, a bank-certified sale agreement with official seals that caught the light of the chandeliers. Anderson, excuse me, Wyn Marine, didn't just sell for good money. As you whispered to Ewan, it sold on December 18th, 2020 for exactly £18.4 million. A collective gasp went through the room. I saw a few guests at the front tables lean forward, their eyes widening. Ewan's head snapped up, his mouth slightly agape. "After taxes and the settlement with Sian," I said, laying the paper down, "I netted £12.8 million in liquid cash. Now, you asked me where that money went. You assumed I'd wasted it or hidden it in a mattress. But I spent 40 years as a shipbuilder, Rhiannon. I know how to keep a vessel afloat." I pulled out the second document, a statement from Pinnacle Private Banking. "Current liquid assets as of last week, £21.5 million. I haven't been spending my capital. I've been living off the passive returns from wind farms and commercial properties, roughly £55,000 a month. To put that in perspective for you, Rhiannon, that is more than my son makes in an entire year of hard work. I could buy that £725,000 villa you're so obsessed with 10 times over, in cash, before the sun sets today. The silence in the hall was now absolute. The air felt thick, charged with the sudden realization that the man they had been ignoring at table 7 was the wealthiest person in the castle. I turned to Iwan. "Son, I know you think I've been living like a hermit because I'm broken, but I lived this way because I needed to know if you loved your father or his balance sheet. I wanted to see who would stand by me when the shipyard was gone. I pulled out the third document. This is a trust fund I established for you in 2020. It currently holds £2.3 million. It was meant to be yours when you turned 35. A safety net to ensure you could follow your passions without fear. But a trust fund is built on values, Iwan. And there is a clause in this paperwork, personally drafted by my friend Gwilym Evans over there, that allows for the dissolution of the fund if the beneficiary demonstrates a fundamental betrayal of family integrity. Like, for instance, threatening to withhold grandchildren for a down payment. Yuan looked like he'd been hit by a physical force. He looked at the paper, then at me, his eyes filling with a mixture of shock and a sudden, sharp clarity. Then I turned back to Rhiannon. Her face had gone from pale to a sickly ashen grey. She tried to speak, her voice a dry rasp. "Alun, this is a misunderstanding." "Oh, it's a misunderstanding, all right," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, surgical level. "But the misunderstanding was yours. You thought you were the only one who knew how to do research." I pulled out the final set of documents, the kill shot provided by Lowry Griffith. I didn't just hold them, I spread them across the table in front of her. "Let's talk about your history, Rhiannon Vaughan. Or should we call you Bethan Jenkins? Or perhaps Sarah Williams? Or Amanda Peterson?" The champagne glass in Rhiannon's hand didn't just slip, it shattered against the table, the crystal shards flying across her borrowed lace dress. She didn't even flinch. She was staring at the photos I had laid out, stills of her at expensive restaurants and luxury events with 4 different men in 4 different cities over the last 6 years. 3 previous engagements, Bethan, I said, using her real name. All to men from wealthy families. All of them ended the exact same way, a demand for a house down payment, followed by a quiet disappearance when the money was secured, or the pressure became too much. The Patterson family in North Wales, the Mitchells in Cardiff, the Johnsons in Swansea. They all have the same story about the sweet consultant who cared so much about family investment. "That's a lie," she shrieked, finally finding her voice. Her face was distorted, the mask of the elegant bride completely gone. "Those are fakes. He's trying to control you, Iwan. He's a manipulative old man." "I'm not lying, Bethan," I said calmly. I gestured toward the side of the room, "and you don't have to take my word for it." Gwilym Evans, the notary, and my oldest friend stood up. He walked to the podium with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades in the halls of law. "I can verify the authenticity of every financial document Alun has presented," Gwilym said, his voice echoing through the hall. "I personally handled the shipyard sale, the trust fund, and the property acquisitions. Furthermore, as the officiant of this ceremony, I am legally obligated to inform the groom that under Welsh law, a marriage contract can be annulled within 72 hours if there is clear evidence of fraudulent intent regarding identity or financial motives." The room erupted. It wasn't a cheer, it was a roar of whispered conversations, gasps, and the scraping of chairs. Rhiannon. Or Bethan looked around the room like a cornered animal. She looked at Iwan, her eyes desperate, but my son wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the photos on the table, the evidence of a professional predator who had been hunting him from the moment they met. "Is it true?" Iwan asked. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the room. "Your name, the other men, is any of it true?" She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. Instead, she did what predators do when the trap fails. She turned vicious. You think I stayed with you for your personality, are you on? She spat, her voice dripping with venom. You're a bore. You're a weak man who couldn't even stand up to his poor father. I worked for months to fix your image, to make you look like something worth having. If your father wants to keep his dirty money and his pathetic little life, he can have them. You're both losers. She grabbed her silk clutch and stalked off the stage, her white train trailing behind her like the skin of a shed snake. The heavy oak doors of the great hall slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a fever that had finally broken. Yuan sat down heavily, his face buried in his hands. I walked over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. I didn't care about the 180 guests watching us. I didn't care about the millions of pounds in the portfolio. I'm sorry, son, I said softly. I would have told you sooner, but I needed you to see her for what she was. He looked up at me, his eyes red. You let me think you were broke. You let her treat you like trash for months. Why, Dad? Because I needed to know if you'd choose love over an ultimatum, I replied. And in the end, when she pushed you, you asked for a loan, not a gift. You called me Dad, not a burden. That was the only investment I ever cared about. I picked up my water glass and looked out at the room. The guests were still frozen, unsure of how to react to the most expensive and shortest wedding in Swansea history. I think, I said into the microphone, we should all have a drink. Not to a marriage, but to the truth. Because the truth is the only thing that actually builds a family. As the room finally began to breathe again, I realized that the lighthouse keeper's job was done. The rocks had been marked, the ship had been steered clear of the reef, and for the first time in 4 years, I wasn't just a man with a secret. I was a father who had his son back. The rain in Swansea doesn't fall, it drifts, a fine silver mist that hangs over the Bristol Channel like a shroud. I sat in a small, tucked-away cafe 3 days after the explosion at the castle. The coffee was strong and black, steaming in a thick ceramic mug that felt solid and honest in my hands. Opposite me sat Yuan. He looked like a man who had been through a physical wreck. The charcoal morning suit was gone, replaced by an old sweater and jeans. His eyes were shadowed, filled with the kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. The fallout had been swifter than even I had anticipated. Within 72 hours, the marriage, if you could even call it that, was legally erased. Gwilym Evans, my notary friend, had moved with surgical precision. The annulment was finalized on the grounds of fraud. Rhiannon, or Bethan Jenkins, to use the name on her birth certificate, hadn't even tried to fight it. When a woman like that is exposed, she doesn't stick around to argue. She moves on to the next hunting ground. She had been escorted from the castle in a borrowed dress, leaving behind a mountain of debt from a wedding she'd never intended to pay for. I watched Ion stare into his cup. He looked up at me, his voice barely a whisper. I feel like an idiot, Dad. How did I not see it? How was I so blind to everything she was doing? She was a professional, Yuan, I said softly. People like Bethan spend their whole lives learning how to identify a person's goodness and turn it into a weakness. She didn't love you. She researched you. The debt is incredible, he admitted, his hands shaking slightly. The rings, the deposits, the designer clothes she insisted I buy for the image. I've cleaned out my savings. I've maxed my cards. I was so busy trying to look successful for her that I actually made myself poor. It was a painful irony. He had been embarrassed by my poverty while he was drowning in actual financial ruin. I'm so sorry, he said, and this time he looked me directly in the eyes. I should have defended you. I should have stood up when she mocked your truck, your clothes, and your life. I let her make me ashamed of the man who raised me. That was the apology I had waited 4 years to hear. Not for the money, but for the loss of our bond. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a checkbook. The old-fashioned kind. I wrote a check for £25,000 and pushed it across the table. He stared at the numbers. "Dad, I can't take this. I don't deserve it." "This isn't for a mansion, and it's not a gift to buy your affection," I told him. "Consider it an early withdrawal from the trust fund. It's to clear the debt she left you with." "I'm not rewarding your mistakes, Yuan. I'm helping you clear the wreckage so you can start building something real." He looked at the check for a long time. "Why live like you do? The 950-pull flat, the rusted Rover, why hide the £21 million? Because money is a tool, not an identity," I replied. "I've spent the last few years being comfortable. There's a difference between being rich and being comfortable. Rich people worry about losing their status. Comfortable people know who they are, regardless of the balance sheet. I needed to know if you loved your father or just the man who sold a shipyard. And now?" he asked. "Now I know." I smiled. We moved forward. I pulled out my phone and showed him a set of photos. It wasn't a colonial villa in a gated suburb. It was a 60-acre coastal farm located on the rugged cliffs north of Aberystwyth. It featured a farmhouse built in the 1950s, a massive stone barn, and a workshop that looked out over the sea. The price was £1.2 million, a significant sum, but for me, it was less than a year's passive income. "You're buying a farm?" Yuan asked, a flicker of genuine interest returning to his eyes. "I'm building a foundation," I said, "not for profit, but for purpose. I want a place where I can restore old boats, where we can teach young people the trades I learned, and where family actually means something. Simple doesn't mean small, Yuan. Simple means intentional." We spent the next hour talking, truly talking, for the first time in years. We talked about the sea, about engineering, and about the future. I saw the weight lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't a heritage conservator trying to impress a gold digger anymore. He was my son again. As we walked out of the cafe and toward our separate cars, his modest sedan and my rusted Land Rover, I stopped him. "Remember this, son," I said, looking at the grey horizon where the sea met the sky. "Love builds people up, manipulation tears them down. Love adds to your life, manipulation only ever subtracts. Never let someone give you an ultimatum regarding your own blood." He hugged me then, a real bone-deep hug. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, son." As I drove back toward the coast, the old Rover rattling but steady, I realized that the quietest victories are often the loudest. I hadn't just saved my fortune. I had saved my son. We were going to build something on those 60 acres that no amount of money could buy, a home built on the truth. This story is a reminder that your value is never defined by the labels on your clothes or the year of your car. The people who truly belong in your life will see your heart even when you're standing in a rust bucket. Don't let the world's version of success blind you to the gold sitting right in front of you. If someone asks you to choose between your dignity and their demands, always choose your dignity. Truth has a way of coming to light, and when it does, make sure you're standing on the side of it. Thank you so much for following Alun's journey. If this story touched you or reminded you of the importance of family, please give this video a like and hit that subscribe button to join our community. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against someone who only saw your surface? Let me know where you're watching from. See you in the next story.
That girl is a runner. She was born to get away. Hear that two-tone humming, headed out to the highway. I should have seen it coming through the years left in the dust, but after